This is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host, and we have a returning guest with us, Dr. Stephen Meyer. And as you know, he's a New York Times best-selling author, and one of his best-selling books is Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell. So he earned his philosophy of science from Cambridge University. And folks, he's here with us today to talk about something I found absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to read this straight from this, I guess you might say, press statement. Sorry, UFO/UAP enthusiasts, God, not aliens, better explains the origin of life on Earth. And I just wanted to say, but that really hit me because, you know, Doctor, I used to be a great fan of Art Bell. I don't know if you're familiar.
Oh, sure. From the late night radio
Yes.
program.
Right.
Yeah. Now hosted by George Norrie, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. And one thing I would notice every so often, he'd have guests come on there. And brother, they would just have a straight out animosity towards anybody who believed in God, or, you know, in particular, or if they just articulated themselves as Christian. Horrible animosity. And they would put forth that argument that, well, life comes from aliens from another planet. And I always said to myself, but they would never really sort of give the evidence for it. They would point out some strange things you would see here and there around the world, but they never really would quite put forth any solid evidence for that. So, you know, were you ever able to could you help my listeners understand their argument?
Yeah, this is the really curious thing, because, you know, we've had this report come out from the Navy to Congress on June 25th. It was completely inconclusive because there are so many competing explanations for the UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomena, that have been recorded. So it's been in the news, but my interest in this actually dates back further, because scientists have been actually proposing alien intelligence, not as an explanation for aerial phenomena, but as an explanation for the origin of the first life. And they've done so because the first living cell, which was long thought to be simple, in Darwin's time, it was even described as a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. It's just like people thought it was goo. And so you could get life going by having a few chemical reactions, and presto changeo, you've got life from non-living chemicals. But it hasn't turned out to be so simple at all. The cell is an immensely complex, integrated chemical factory that's the interworkings of which are run by a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system. And the underlying technology in that is actually digital code. It's the DNA present in the information present in the DNA directs the construction of all the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. And that machinery is intricate and very complex. So this has been the mind-blowing sort of discovery of modern biology, is that simple cell isn't simple at all. And that has created an impasse in attempts to explain the evolution of life, the origin of the first life, from simpler non-living chemicals. That's called chemical evolutionary theory. And even the great scientific atheist, spokesman for scientific atheists, Richard Dawkins, has publicly acknowledged that, quote, no one knows how life evolved from simpler non-living chemicals in that sort of way. And in a 2008 documentary titled Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, Dawkins was interviewed by Ben Stein. And at the end of the film, Ben got Dawkins to acknowledge that evolutionary biologists have not explained the origin of the first life. Dawkins went on to further speculate that, yes, there could be a signature of intelligence inside life, but it must have issued from an alien intelligence that had evolved by completely naturalistic means on some other planet.
Hmm.
Now, there's an obvious problem with that explanation in that it doesn't explain the ultimate origin of the information and information processing systems that are necessary to make even the simplest forms of life first emerge, whether on another planet or here. So it just begs the ultimate question, or rather kicks it out into space without answering it. And Dawkins later admitted or expressed regret about having speculated on camera about this with Ben Stein, but no less a personage in science than Francis Crick himself, the co-discoverer of DNA, posited this idea. It's known in science as directed panspermia. And other scientists, such as Sir Fred Hoyle, also have proposed life coming from space. And so this is actually a very persistent speculation in the scientific community, and it's been predicated on the observation of the immense complexity of the cell and indeed the information-bearing properties of the DNA molecule and the other large molecules that make life possible. We know information always comes from a mind or an intelligence. So rather than positing divine intelligence, these scientists have suggested, well, life here must have come from some other intelligence, but one within the cosmos that itself evolved by completely undirected natural processes.
So you had mentioned what you just said there, panspermia. Panspermia. Okay. I've never heard that term before, and I wanted to.
That's the term of the technical term for this theory: directed panspermia, the life being seeded here on a directed basis by an intelligence from outer space.
From outer space. Now, do they go as far as to speculate? Where this intelligence outer space, where this intelligence in outer space is located?
Not that much detail usually. Of course, one of the big interesting new development in science is the awareness that whereas before scientists pretty much assumed that life was inevitable elsewhere in the cosmos because there are so many galaxies and therefore so many planetary systems, recent thinking among astronomers has shifted a bit. There was a book in 2005, I believe, by two University of Washington astronomers, Peter Ward and Don Brownlee, titled Rare Earth. And they said, yeah, there are a lot of other galaxies out there, but we have to balance that against the number of parameters that must be just right to allow for life to exist. And whereas if you think of a simple equation, then the numerator might be the number of all those other galaxies and star systems. But the denominator, that's got to be balanced against the denominator of the immense improbability of getting the conditions right anywhere. And they expressed skepticism about the idea that life might exist anywhere else in the universe because of the immense improbability associated with the multiple parameters that have to be just right against all odds. And another book called Privileged Planet made the same case and expanded that to suggest that life here, the parameters that made life here on this planet possible exhibited evidence of intelligent design, but not design of an alien. I think those authors meant God Almighty.
Folks, this is a Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host, and I'm speaking with Dr. Stephen Meyer, author of the book, Return of the God Hypothesis. Doctor, as we wrap things up a little bit, why do you think some of these scientists are so adamant against even sort of saying to themselves, well, maybe there's a God, maybe? They just seem to be so adamant about it. It's adamant against it.
Yeah, I certainly encountered that. And in fact, when Ben Stein interviewed Dawkins, he told the producers afterwards that he called Dawkins's theory the ABG hypothesis, anything but God. So, well, I think it's part of the intellectual heritage we've received from the 19th century. In the wake of the Darwinian Revolution, figures like Marx, then later in the early 20th century, figures like Freud, a new worldview developed. Scholars call it scientific materialism, whereas science arose originally in a decidedly Judeo-Christian context in Western Europe, and for very significant Judeo-Christian reasons. The early scientists thought that they were revealing the handiwork of God in their study of nature, and they believed that nature revealed the glory of God. That's actually the title of a great work in the history of science by the Baylor historian of science, Rodney Stark, published with Princeton University Press, For the Glory of God. That's what science was about in its early days. By the late 19th century, that perspective was largely lost, and you had figures like Darwin, who told us where we came from, Marx, who had a utopian vision of the future, and then Freud, who came along a bit later and told us what to do about the human condition and our sense of guilt. And between these three figures and other 19th century figures, the big worldview questions that traditionally Judeo-Christian religion had answered, these questions were now answered in a purely secular, materialistic way. And so there was sort of an established or default way of thinking that intellectuals adopted, and it became kind of the assumed view of all reasonable people. And that has affected the way science has been done. Many scientists today, think that it's part of their duty to explain everything, even the origin of the universe or the origin of life, by reference to strictly materialistic processes, without any reference to evidence of design or the possibility that creative intelligence played a role. And yet, when they find evidence of creative intelligence in the form of that sophisticated information processing system that's inside living cells, rather than attribute the origin of that system to a transcendent intelligence, they rather think, well, it must be an intelligence within the cosmos that evolved by strictly materialistic processes, so they can get back to that fundamental assumption of materialism. But that is an assumption. It's not proven. It's not something that the evidence necessarily supports, that the prime realities in the universe are just matter and energy. After all, we ourselves have minds. And there is every possibility. There are two big possibilities. Either the universe has existed forever rather, let's put it this way. Either matter and energy are the things from which everything else comes and have existed forever. They're eternal, self-existent, and self-organizing. Or matter and energy were created by an external mind or agent who then shaped matter and energy to bring all the sophisticated and beautiful structures that we see in the living world, for example, into existence. So it's mind first or matter first are the two great choices in philosophy. And the argument of my new book is that the major discoveries that we've made that are pertinent to understanding biological and cosmological origins point to the mind first view. The universe itself has not been here eternally. It is not eternally self-existent. We now have very good reason to think that the universe had a beginning. It's been finely tuned against all odds to make life possible. And then from the beginning, and then we have this digital information that arises long after the beginning. When I add those three pieces of evidence up, to me, that says theism. It points to a transcendent intelligence who is also active in the creation, certainly not materialism.
And this is based on evidence and a rational
cosmology, physics, and biology. The great discoveries in modern astrophysics, the great discovery has been that, as best we can tell, the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy began a finite time ago, before which we can't invoke matter, space, time, and energy as the cause of the origin of the universe, because they are the things that came into existence. They're with the origin of the universe. Similarly, physicists have discovered that we live in a Goldilocks universe where all the basic parameters of physics fall within very narrow ranges against all odds and for no underlying physical reason, making life possible. And then again, life is far more complex than we ever thought. And it's a kind of complexity that we know from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning. It's a kind of complexity, an informational complexity that always indicates the activity of a prior mind.
Now, you made reference to your book. Are you talking about Return of the God Hypothesis?
Exactly. That's the new book that I've just had published in this March. It builds on arguments that I've made in previous books. One in particular called "Signature in the Cell," which was about the information-bearing properties of DNA and the information technology that's been discovered inside living cells. It's a little side note, but just couple of weeks ago, Richard Dawkins, again, the world's foremost spokesman for scientific atheists, tweeted that he was, quote, knocked sideways by the wonderment and amazement he felt at the data processing systems that were at work inside living cells. And he provided a link to an animation of something called the DNA replication system. And it was an animation provided by an Australian medical group. And Dawkins expressed his awe and wonder at this, but made no attempt to explain its origin. And I think that's where intelligent design comes in. When we find information and information processing systems, in our experience, they've always arisen from intelligent agency, usually from software engineers. So I've argued that the information technology inside living cells points to a master programmer for life.
Well, that's a beautiful way to put it. Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. We have with us Dr. Stephen Meyer, New York Times best-selling author, and the author of the book, Return of the God Hypothesis. Doctor, I'm assuming you can get it anywhere like Amazon.com and Barnes and Nobles and those usual places.
All those usual places, indie books and Books A Million, and of course Amazon. There's a spirited review war going on at Amazon. The sort of aggressive atheists are weighing in, and people on the other side defending the book. But it's exciting conversation. So we're glad people are taking notice of it.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. I probably shouldn't include this, but one thing I do is I teach chess, and one of my chess coaches, he's actually a Quaker, but I noticed that he immediately picked up your book and started reading it. And he probably went through, this guy has 5 PhDs, by the way. He immediately went through like 2 chapters and just started talking to me about this stuff. And I'm saying to myself, dude, that sounds something up. It was some really deep things he was bringing out in reaction to your book.
Fantastic. We live in a time when people have just assumed that faith in God has no rational basis. And so when you put this out there very explicitly, the subtitle of the book is 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Yes. The old formula was the religious people had the faith and the scientists had the facts. But what if the scientific facts support faith? What if they point to the reality of God? That's a whole new way of looking at things. It's not a completely new way, because that was the way that the scientists who got science going, the scientific revolutionaries from 1500 to 1750, Kepler, Boyle, Newton, those guys, they thought science pointed to God, and they did science to glorify God. And the argument of the book is that perspective is coming back. Or if it isn't, it should be, because the scientific evidence is pointing in a decidedly theistic direction. The facts are supporting faith in God.
That's a beautiful way to conclude this. Doctor, I really appreciate your time today. And of course, let's please keep in touch. And obviously, are you having another book come out soon?
I'm pretty happy to get this one over the finish line. I worked on it 3.5 years actively. I've been thinking about it for 35 years. And so right now, we do have, by the way, we have a documentary that's being made about the film that will probably be titled The Story of Everything, or a documentary being made about the book. And we're hoping to release that next year. The Seattle-based documentary company working with us on it, and it's a pretty exciting project because they've collected interviews with scientists from all around the world who are seeing what I've been seeing, and who we're providing additional testimony in support of the idea that scientific evidence in their fields is pointing to a designing intelligence, and indeed one that has the attributes that traditional theists have always ascribed to God.
Fantastic. Doctor, thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch, okay?
You bet. Thank you for having me on again.
Sure.